The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I have a story for you today that is both childish and very disturbing, which is actually a surprisingly common combination in the current era. It's being reported that the president is increasingly using his personal mobile phone to call people without Chief of Staff John Kelly knowing about it. And arguably, it's also to get around White House records of the calls that take place. And the sort of immediate obvious question is, who is Trump calling that he doesn't want John Kelly to know about? And what is it that they're talking about during these phone calls? And we know, because multiple sources inside the White House have revealed it, that when Trump uses the White House switchboard system to make calls, it generates a log, it generates a list of calls, that goes to the Chief of Staff. Formerly it was Reince Priebus, now it's John Kelly. When Trump uses his personal cell phone, it is much more difficult for John Kelly to know what's going on unless someone tells him, hey, by the way, Trump called X, Y, or Z. And this is very, very telling, especially when you consider why it was that John Kelly was brought in and some of the changes that happened right after John Kelly was brought in. He came in replacing Reince Priebus and was sort of seen as the guy who was going to get the riffraff out of the Oval Office. Very quickly, Sean Spicer left, Anthony Scaramucci was out, Steve Bannon was gone, and as sources in the White House say, Trump is trying to get Kelly out of the way as a gatekeeper by using his mobile phone and to continue talking to some of these people. There are unrelated reports that say Corey Lewandowski is in touch directly with Trump on his mobile phone. Lewandowski was Trump's former very, very wacky campaign manager, and John Kelly specifically tried to put some distance between Trump and Lewandowski, obviously because Lewandowski is an absolutely terrible influence on Trump. So we have kind of like a political question. The concern politically is, who's Trump talking to, what are they talking about, and how is that influencing Trump's position on policy? The legal question is about the White House records and about security concerns. The White House switchboard system is designed for sensitive topics to be discussed. It's a secure system, it is a tracked system, it's logged, and it is private. Is Trump talking about classified information on his personal phone? Because anyone could be taking advantage of the security vulnerabilities on Trump's personal phone, and those conversations would not be logged and captured just for government accountability and transparency. They could also be intercepted by foreign powers or even by American intelligence. And that's sort of where my curiosity is on this thing, right? Number one, could Trump's personal phone be bugged by a foreign intelligence service? That's the obvious question. But question number two about Trump's personal cell phone use is it possible that one of our own intelligence services is surveilling Donald Trump's phone? And this is potentially a major breach of security protocol. And remember, this is the guy who ran on Hillary can't be trusted because of her emails and her email server and documents, and Huma Abedin, it's all sloppy and let's lock her up. And as usual, projection. Is there anything the guy accused Hillary or Obama of that he's not doing himself?
Yeah, and as with all things in the Trump administration, it could be a question, too, of if this is incompetence or if it's something nefarious. Because
Absolutely.
Maybe he's doing this deliberately. It could be a way to establish a back channel with another entity. Could be the Russians. I don't know. I mean, it gets a little bit conspiratorial, but we just don't know.
Yeah, Pat, all going completely full in on completely unproven conspiracies. But who can blame the guy, right? Because look at what's been going on for the last 15 months. But no, I think that the key question always applies here, which is Donald Trump like the incompetent kid hiding from mommy and using his mobile phone so that John Kelly doesn't get a printout of who he talked to? Or is it actually far more calculated and nefarious? And you never know with Trump.
And what's happened to John Kelly, too? I mean, the guy is a Marine Corps general.
Yeah.
And then he was the director of the Department of Homeland Security.
Super
what a
elegant.
fall from grace. Now he's just a caretaker.
And he might be out soon. And that's actually the next thing that I want to talk about. Yesterday, we have talked about how Donald Trump increasingly is struggling in his relationships with a number of the people that are working directly for him. Just now, today, I told you about how Donald Trump is increasingly using his personal cell phone to contact people without Chief of Staff John Kelly knowing about those calls. And obviously, that's a sign to us that the relationship between Trump and John Kelly might not be so good. And it is now increasingly being discussed that John Kelly might be out soon. Remember, Kelly is already Trump's second Chief of Staff. You had Reince Priebus, Chief of Staff #1. John Kelly, the elegant John Kelly, is often referred to by Donald Trump, Chief of Staff #2. And the rumor now is that John Kelly might be replaced by a guy named Mick Mulvaney as Chief of Staff #3. Mulvaney's the head of the White House Office of Management and Budget. He's the interim head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a very scary story that we could talk about in and of itself, but not today. He's also a former congressman who represented South Carolina. And Mulvaney admitted this week that he effectively sold himself to the lobbyists that gave him money when he was a congressman. And he tried to couch it. They always have some super innocent spin on this stuff. And Mulvaney tried to couch it as, listen, it's nothing to worry about. The constituents of my district actually had top priority and top access to me. But he said a couple days ago to the American Bankers Association that, quote, we had a hierarchy in office, in my office in Congress. If you're a lobbyist who never gave us money, I didn't talk to you. If you're a lobbyist who gave us money, I might talk to you. Obviously, if you push Mulvaney, he would say, there was no guarantee that if you gave me money, I would meet with you. But he is saying that if you didn't get me money, I wouldn't even consider meeting with you. And he also said, again, that at the top of the hierarchy are his constituents, which, of course, is something that any reasonable congressman would say, whether it's true or not. But the important thing is, don't be led astray on this thing, right? He's saying what we all know. This is how the system works. It's a horrifying system. Lobbyists bought access to him when he was a congressman. And you can rephrase it a different way, right? The innocent way is, I would prioritize my constituents over everybody, and giving me money is no guarantee that I would meet with you if you're a lobbyist. You could put it a different way, which is, if you want to meet with him, you have to give him money. If you didn't, he wouldn't even consider meeting with you. And as usual, the double standard. We don't know whether he is going to be Trump's third chief of staff, but when President Trump was candidate Trump, he said the money influence system in Washington is a disaster. He was the populist, anti-cronyism, anti-lobbyist guy. He was going to drain the swamp and stop the revolving door. Hiring a guy who admits to selling access to run your staff is not exactly what I would call a draining of the swamp.
And I also think it's pretty clear that Mick Mulvaney messed up not by the selling of access, but in the eyes of the media and, you know, just the general public, he messed up because he admitted to it. You're supposed to just not say this. I mean, this is business as usual in politics, but most people are smart enough not to say it.
Well, I would not at all be surprised if we hear a defense from Trump, if he does end up getting rid of John Kelly and hiring Mick Mulvaney, of saying, listen, I continue to insist that the system that Mick Mulvaney participated in is a bad system. I participated in it because I'm smart, and I admitted during the debates that I use the legal means available to get politicians to do what I want. But we can't just penalize Mick Mulvaney because he did not create the system. He's just working within it. And we will see if that is a sort of defense that's given. And then, as usual, there's a tweet for everything, right? Trump had Chief of Staff #1, Reince Priebus. He has Chief of Staff #2, John Kelly. And if he brings in Mick Mulvaney anytime soon, that would be 3 chiefs of staff in about a 15 or 16-month period. Check out what President Trump tweeted back in January of 2012 about Barack Obama's chiefs of staff, saying 3 chief of staffs, by the way, it's chiefs of staff, but I don't think at this point we can hold Trump to any kind of grammatical standard. 3 chief of staffs in less than 3 years of being president. Part of the reason why Barack Obama can't manage to pass his agenda. A tweet for every occasion. Is there anything that Trump criticized Obama for that he hasn't done himself to maybe an even greater degree? And then we also have the total implosion when it comes to staffing and nominations of White House Dr. Ronnie Jackson, who famously said that Donald Trump is 6 feet 3 inches tall, 239 pounds, and could potentially live to be 200 years of age if he improves his diet and exercise. He now is withdrawing his name, but we're going to get to that on tomorrow's program. So just the big picture of the chaos in the White House story, that's not going away.
quick point here, too. Trump has had 5 communications directors.
Oh, yeah.
Once he replaces Hope Hicks, he'll have 6. Obama only had 5, and he was president for 8 years. Whereas Trump, it's been like a little over a year.
Now, in Trump's defense, weren't some of those 5, like, there were the same people who had multiple stints?
Yeah, Sean Spicer had a comeback.
Yeah.
So that was a nice little story, but I think it's 4 individuals total, yeah.
So certainly the idea that everything is very, very calm and operating business as usual. I mean, I guess this is business as usual in the White House, which is people are senior after 6 weeks, if they're lucky to last that long. And the revolving door that Trump has stopped when it comes to lobbyists, supposedly, seems to have been replaced by the revolving door of White House staff and secretaries. So we'll be following that. Send me your thoughts about Mick Mulvaney. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Julian Ross. Julian, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member, supporter of independent media, and today's long-term sustaining member of the day. Not only someone who's a friend of mine and a friend of the show, not only someone who's been with us since April of 2012, but someone who has contributed content to this program, whether the audience knows it or not. Greg Stevens. Greg Stevens, today's sustaining member of the day. Julian, Greg, thank you. Join them at davidpakman.com/membership. If you want to save 40% off of your membership, very simple. Use the coupon code VOTESOON18. This morning on our Reddit discussion forum or subreddit, some people hate it when I call it a Reddit discussion forum. I know that it's just a subreddit, but for people who are not Reddit savvy, I want to use a term that would explain to them what it is, because like a subreddit doesn't really tell you what it is. So I like to say this is where people can discuss stuff.
I like both terms. It's good for word choice, too.
Yeah.
You got to switch it up every now and
Right,
then.
exactly. Otherwise, I end up using the word vile 100 times in a show, and we know how that goes. A very interesting discussion about a Sam Seder Majority Report commentary on Jordan Peterson's recent appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher. And as people on this program know, I have been a significant critic of Jordan Peterson. I think that he has one of the most sophisticated forms of sort of anti-SJW self-help type nonsense that really appeals to a big contingent of the internet male world. I don't even know what to call it. And in any case, Sam Seder doing a very good job of picking apart Peterson's appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher, which I watched, and a lot of people in our audience liking and some not liking Sam Seder's commentary. Also from the subreddit, another addition to the David Pakman Show drinking turn bingo game. A spot on the board should be reserved for any time David segues into a new topic by saying, hey, this is sort of weird.
Yeah.
I do say that a lot. Sometimes you don't know how to introduce a new topic, or I don't know, and I will say something like, hey, this is sort of weird. Donald Trump was caught in another lie about the PP tape or whatever.
Yeah.
I just don't know how else to introduce some of these topics.
Well, you have your go-tos.
Yeah.
And I think one of them is, I think you're going to like this.
I think you're going to like this. Yeah, that's another one that I do like. I think that that's fair for the bingo board to have, hey, this is weird as a show segue. So very, very perceptive. Also, major tumult as a result of producer Pat caught on camera during a split-screen moment, agreeing with me in a way that I guess some people are arguing seems a little bit disingenuous. Like, I think that's the criticism. We're going to put up on the screen Pat agreeing with something I was saying, nodding, and then sort of putting his chin to hand or hand to chin in a sort of thinking man's position. And a couple people picking this up, and one actually doing more of like a zoom in on Pat when he was doing this agreeing motion. Can you explain, Pat, whether this, like, is that a disingenuous agreement where you're sort of like by nodding in a very unusual way, implying you don't agree with me?
Well, I do that a lot. I'd have to like go back and play the video and see what we were actually talking about, because I honestly don't know.
You don't remember?
Yeah, but I think that looks pretty genuine, don't
really?
you?
I don't know. It strikes me as pretty disingenuous, but I think that we'll leave it to the audience to decide. But yeah, going back to the video would be useful. But interestingly, multiple people picking up on the fact that at a certain point during Monday's show, Pat was agreeing. It's almost like nodding your head yes while your eyes communicate panic that you actually don't agree with what's going on. It's sort of like an equivalent.
People also like how we were wearing the same shirt.
Yeah.
It's like, it's cute, you know?
Yeah, yeah. That's
I
a
almost
topic.
went home and changed.
That's a
but
topic
decided
for a
not to.
different day. Check it out at davidpakman.com/Reddit. Participate. About 6,000 of our viewers and listeners now regularly discussing politics there. Okay, the big news a couple of days ago was that North Korea suspended its tests of nuclear weapons capabilities. And of course, immediately Donald Trump's flunkies touted it as this just major, major accomplishment of Trump's administration and of his testicular fortitude. And they tried to say Kim Jong-un is finally just accepting the reality that he must stop nuclear testing because of the strength of Trump and the fear of a bloody nose attack or who knows what. And it was touted as a big win in the geopolitical battle of ideas or actions. I don't know. Except that we've now learned that North Korea's nuclear testing location actually collapsed right after 5 nuclear blasts. And this puts a completely different spin on Kim Jong-un's announcement that nuclear testing is stopping, which might not be because of Kim Jong-un just being very, very afraid of Donald Trump or because of anything that Trump did, but rather because their nuclear testing location broke, not because of geopolitical pressure. And these nuclear tests have been taking place on a mountain called Mount Mantap. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And a recent test that sort of went wrong reportedly tore open a hole in the mountain, and a part of the mountain collapsed on itself. So first is the political implication, right? What was being touted by Trump as a victory for his politics may have been actually a self-inflicted wound by North Korea. But there's actually real humanitarian concerns here. There's radiation concerns, the possibility of major fallout leaks, the possibility of radioactive dust escaping through holes or cracks in the mountain. And then politically, there's also another element here, which is that the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Kim Jong-un is not actually even saying he's going to stop the development of nuclear weapons. He would be stopping these specific tests, which is a very different scenario than the one that the Trump administration touted, which is the entire program looking to develop nuclear weapon capabilities is being stopped. So the big picture is that it's not surprising that this ultimately went bad for North Korea. Doing land-based nuke testing is something that is quite risky. I think most of us can understand that. The most likely scenario is that North Korea's announcement about nuclear development, number one, is not a signal that they're going to stop all development of nuclear weapons altogether, just that they're not going to do testing at this particular site. And number two, they are setting up to most likely at this upcoming summit with South Korea, ask for completely not viable things or concessions from South Korea, and also to agree to completely unenforceable verbiage. This is how North Korea works. They will agree to provisions in principle that are very, very difficult to enforce, but also say things like, we are ready to stop all nuclear research as soon as the Korean Peninsula is denuclearized completely, which to them means that all American troops leave South Korea because American troops represent the United States, which is, of course, a nuclear power. It's just not going to happen, right? And this is how things have worked for a long time. It's not for better or worse. It just is. If you look at the 1992 Agreement on Reconciliation between North and South Korea, if you look at the joint declaration of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, we've had a number of not just discussions, but ostensible agreements before, and yet we still are where we are today. So what's being presented here as a major change in North Korean government attitudes is actually pretty similar to what we've seen for decades from various North Korean leaders. So what we have to do here is not just wait and see what comes out of the meeting, but wait and see what actions come out of whatever agreement is made at the meeting and in the years that follow. And I would not be at all surprised. I'm optimistic. I would love to see actual changes in North Korea. I would not be surprised if we basically see more of the same. We've now learned that Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, plans to assert his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, known colloquially as pleading the Fifth or taking the Fifth, in the lawsuit filed against him by adult film actress Stormy Daniels. That's the one where Cohen was involved in a $130,000 hush money payment and possibly the coordination of physical intimidation of Stormy Daniels to keep her quiet, according to her assertion in the recent 60 Minutes interview. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, there's a Trump tweeter statement for everything, and I have it here for you. Here's a nice little compilation from MSNBC. Remember, this is Trump's lawyer who will be pleading the Fifth. Here is Trump's past opinions about people who plead the Fifth.
When you have your staff taking the Fifth Amendment, taking the Fifth so they're not prosecuted, when you have the man that set up the illegal server taking the Fifth, I think it's disgraceful.
Fifth Amendment. The mob takes the Fifth. If you're innocent, why are you taking the Fifth Amendment?
Right.
Fifth Amendment. Horrible. Horrible.
He pleaded the Fifth, and that was the end. We never heard about him again. This is like Watergate, only it's worse. Because here, our foreign enemies were in a position to hack our most sensitive national security.
That's, by the way, if you were watching that last one, that's Trump in teleprompter mode, where he goes between the chop full hand, like a paper and rock, paper, scissors, and the thumbs up, one word at a time. So that's teleprompter mode for him.
Okay sign.
Yes, of course, which I'm sure also is another one of his placating white nationalists. You heard about that, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah, where like that sign, the thumbs, the okay sign, not the thumbs up, is also some reference to white nationalists. Who even can keep track at this point? Anyway, long history of Trump's statements about remaining silent. He also once tweeted about Bill Cosby, tweeting, "I am no fan of Bill Cosby, but nevertheless some free advice, which is worth what people paid for it. If you are innocent, do not remain silent. You look guilty as hell." And the truth is that there's more than just verbal hypocrisy here, because Trump has also pled the Fifth himself, right? During his 1990 divorce from Ivana Trump, for example. I almost said Ivanka Trump, which refers to a number of other stories we've done. During his divorce from Ivana Trump, Trump also pled the Fifth. But hey, nobody's perfect. And the big story is not actually even Trump's hypocrisy. It's the legal implications here. Because the reason that Cohen is citing for pleading the Fifth in this California lawsuit by Stormy is that he currently is being investigated criminally in the Southern District of New York, also known to us as the Robert Mueller Trump-Russia investigation. And what this means is that Michael Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer, is now in so deep criminally that he's pleading the Fifth in one case because of being a criminal target in another major case. What this will allow Michael Cohen to do, or I guess not to do, is that Cohen can avoid being deposed and having to give up what is arguably sensitive information related to the criminal investigation in the Stormy Daniels civil case. I do find it hilarious that all of a sudden now the Trumpists are flooding social media with comments that, hey, pleading the Fifth is not a guilty plea, as if that's really what they're concerned about when it's Trump slamming people for pleading the Fifth. And the truth is they're right, right? In a criminal case, pleading the Fifth is not only not an admission of guilt, you were also instructed by judges in criminal cases not to consider a defendant's pleading the Fifth in your evaluation of whether they are or are not guilty. In other words, they have chosen not to testify. It's not an admission of guilt. You can't include that in determining guilt or innocence. But there's another angle to this. That's in a criminal case. This is a civil case. In a civil case, juries actually are allowed to see pleading the Fifth, not as an indication of guilt, but as one of a desire for secrecy. And it can be held against you in a civil case. That is what a lot of people who are online saying, you're not pleading guilty by pleading the Fifth. That's right, but it can be considered in a civil trial.
Yeah, and I think that the Fifth Amendment is an important constitutional right, especially because most of us aren't lawyers. And so even if we are innocent, we may do something that self-incriminates. We could get caught in a lie. Sure. But Michael Cohen is a lawyer, so you'd think that if he has the facts on his side, he should be able to argue his way out of this.
Listen, just go to Trump's numerous on-the-record statements about pleading the Fifth, right? That would be the guy who can really explain to us how she would interpret this. So strictly speaking, no, pleading the Fifth is not a guilty plea, other than the fact that this is a civil case and it actually could be considered by the jury if it gets to that point. This guy is in a heap of trouble, and I would be shocked if he doesn't end up indicted at some point in the next several months. Discuss this with us on our subreddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. We'll take a quick break, and next I will talk to Keith Whittington about the problem of censorship and free speech on college and university campuses.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Keith Whittington, who's a professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, also author of the book Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Keith, this is a super interesting topic to me, and I've covered this pretty extensively, and I've expressed concerns about attempts to sort of limit certain types of speech on campuses, about so-called safe spaces and trigger warnings, and whether that's doing a service or disservice to college students sort of in the context of the real world that they'll eventually be living in. But I've also sort of expressed concern with how widespread some claim this issue to be relative to how widespread I believe it to be. So to sort of get us into the conversation, what's your primary concern with what you observe happening on college and university campuses right now?
Sure. Well, I think it's clear there are some problems. I think it's unclear how extensive problems are. This has been a feature of campus life off and on for 100 years. And so now we're getting a lot of reporting about speakers being shouted down. There's videos that go viral of it. And so it's much easier to see it when it happens. It's not completely evident that this is a lot more common now than it was 20 years ago. For example, but it's clearly a problem, and it's a problem indicative of people being intolerant of views they find offensive and disagreeable when people come to campus. But as we also saw the other day with the professor at Fresno State, people off campus can be very intolerant to views they regard as offensive that are being spoken on campuses.
Yeah, and I feel like there's this sort of never-ending, sort of like an infinite regression that takes place whenever we talk about this, where there seems to be sort of a fundamental misunderstanding in some cases, particularly when it comes to these college speaking tours that have become very, very in vogue among a lot of political movements, where on the one hand, if someone has been scheduled to speak, we should oppose sort of violent protest or the physical prevention of that person speaking, in my opinion, but at the same time, not allowing someone to speak in the sense that they're not going to be invited, that's by no means an infringement on anyone's First Amendment rights or even on free speech, I would argue. In other words, no one has a right to speak at any college that they want to speak at. So I feel like the conversation often gets very, very muddled, and the terms First Amendment and free speech are very often misused as well. Are you experiencing that same thing?
Oh, for sure. I think the debate is often very muddled. In part because these are somewhat complex debates, in part because people aren't very clear. I think you're absolutely right that universities should be thoughtful about who they're bringing to campus to talk to students. And some of the invitations are being extended by faculty and administrators. Some invitations for outside speakers are extended by student groups. In both cases, people really need to think about why they're inviting particular people to campus, what they're hoping to accomplish by bringing them, and hopefully try to bring in people that they think are interesting and helpful and going to help a campus conversation. But if they have the authority to bring somebody in and they've made decisions about who they ought to invite in, we all allow those people to speak. Everyone on the campus has a right to hear from the people that they think are going to be useful. And once they're there, then it's appropriate to argue that people made a bad choice about who they brought in, but it's not appropriate to try to shut them down and prevent them from being able to speak.
Now, at the same time, it's important to note that the speaker does not get to have total immunity from the consequences of the specific speech that they plan to put out there, right? And that's where we then get to what is and is not appropriate in terms of counter demonstrations. Certainly, demonstrations in principle are protected by the First Amendment, and they should be encouraged and defended to the extent that they're not breaking any laws. But how can we sort of open a conversation about what that line is? Because to say there can be no consequences to the speaker or the university to the speech that they are inviting on campus would also be problematic.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we should expect that there can be demonstrations and protests when a controversial speaker comes to campus. You can certainly expect that there'll be conversations on campus, op-eds being written, other events occurring that are all designed to counter that speech, and that's all perfectly reasonable. I think where we have to draw the line is efforts to prevent people from actually being able to hear the speaker. Efforts to block access to the venue. We've seen examples of that kind of thing, such that the audience can't even get in to hear the speaker. Efforts to shut down the speech once it's occurred and prevent the speech from taking place. Those we really ought to regard as off limits. But beyond that, it's perfectly reasonable to express opposition and concerns about a particular speaker who's come to campus. No one should come to campus to give a talk and then expect they're not going to receive criticism if their views are controversial.
So let me play devil's advocate with that a little bit. There is a common view among some, I won't even really characterize who, but it's sort of a common view that speech in response to speech is appropriate, but that anything physical in response to speech is not appropriate. And the counter argument to that would be, sometimes the speech in itself advocates real-world violence. So as an example, if you bring someone to a campus who is, for example, an anti-Semitic white supremacist who believes effectively that Jews should be done away with, right? And you could figure out what that means. That even though it's just speech, that it is speech calling for real-world violence, action, extermination, whatever, and thus that it actually would be okay to use physical violence or physical means in order to counter that speech. What do you think of that argument?
Right. I think we ought to be very, very cautious about extending that kind of argument. I think it's worth thinking hard if you're inviting people to campus about the kind of person you're bringing into campus. And people who are advocating violence might not be the best choice for people to bring to campus, precisely because there may be better people making better arguments that are more reasonable. But the Supreme Court has struggled over the course of the 20th century to expand the ability of people to express controversial views and to express dissent. And sometimes that includes people calling for violence. Sometimes it's the violent overthrow of the government. Sometimes it's violence against businesses. Sometimes it's even violence against groups of people. And the court, I think correctly, has emphasized that if we're going to have a robust public debate about a wide-ranging set of ideas, we have to accept the fact that sometimes people are going to advocate for violent actions. Where we have to draw the line is for them to actually conspire to engage in violent actions, for them to threaten violent actions against particular individuals. And I think likewise on campus, we should draw that line, but we should accept that some people are going to come to campus and they might in fact make arguments that do encourage violence, and we should regard that as acceptable.
How can we sort of get a handle on how pervasive the problem is on campuses? And the reason I ask is, you mentioned at the beginning, we don't actually know whether this is more prevalent now than 20 years ago. We know that it's certainly being discussed much more, and part of that, I would argue, is because you have this sort of anti-social justice warrior, free speech warrior movement that has become very, very popular among particularly some enclaves of the internet. But is it sort of like, is cancer actually more common, or are people living longer and thus alive long enough to develop some kind of cancer, but it's not actually the cancer rate that's gone up? Right? It seems like that's sort of an analogy to what might be going on here.
I think that's right. I think these come in waves to some degree, and I think we are seeing an uptick in how many of these disruptive protests are occurring, and disinvitations and the like. And I expect it eventually will settle down a little bit. I think to some degree we're also recognizing how often this in fact happens. So the fact that they can now draw attention to it has sort of highlighted the fact that this has always been happening to some degree on campus, and it's been a problem. And we ought to recognize it's a problem. We also don't want to overstate the degree to which it's a problem. So it's also true that controversial speakers come to campus all the time and are able to give speeches without any problems. There are faculty on campus and students on campus who give controversial speeches all the time without a problem. And so for the most part, campus speech works perfectly fine. But there are occasions when people behave very badly. And I think it's important that we call that out when it happens and that we try to explain what the correct principles are to try to avoid those instances of happening again.
Going beyond just the speeches and the protests of speeches, what about in the classroom? I mean, do you have a sense of, because that's another area where you see some of these so-called free speech warriors claim that there is a major, major growing problem, which is that dissenting ideas, anything but sort of progressive orthodoxy is just not tolerated in the classroom by departments, by individual professors. Do you have reason to believe that that's a unique problem that's going on right now, a growing problem?
I don't know if it's a growing problem. I think it's a genuine problem in some instances. I don't think it's a pervasive problem on the whole. Undoubtedly, there are some faculty who probably did not behave as well as they should and professionally as they should in the classroom, and students sometimes feel that. I think students are sometimes quick to make the assumption that they're being treated unfairly because of their political views, when in fact faculty have a responsibility to try to guide classroom discussions, to take into account countervailing arguments, to think seriously about material in front of them. And students are sometimes resistant to that because they find that the arguments and materials they're being confronted with are disagreeable. Students then think that their own views and speech are being suppressed because they have to actually engage with materials in the way that we want them to engage. So it's sometimes hard to tease out whether students are correctly perceiving that they're being frowned upon by faculty and other students, or whether they're misreading the situation. I think there is also a very genuine problem in classrooms with a lot of self-censorship. Students are very nervous about how other students will perceive them. And that results in some students not speaking up as much as they should, not really giving voice to their ideas because they're so worried about what the reaction might be. And we want to encourage students to be willing and able to speak up in class, to put forward arguments that sometimes are going to be mistaken and sometimes going to be wrong. But it's important that we be able to think it through and people be able to talk about those things in the classroom. We all recognize people are going to sometimes say things in the classroom that is mistaken, maybe even offensive, but that's part of learning.
So to the extent that you believe this to be a problem, what's the solution? Is it some kind of department policy, some kind of academic fairness doctrine of sorts? I mean, how is this something that you can fix?
Right. So I think in part, it's important that faculty and university administrators be on the same page about what free speech principles are and be clear that they're committed to them. Sometimes that has policy consequences about what exactly the regulations are that are guiding the university, and those need to be stated clearly and they need to be enforced. So students are disruptive of activities on campus, for example. Administrators need to be clear that's not acceptable and they need to enforce those policies. I think it's also probably important to help orient students when they arrive to campus about what they should expect to encounter there. I think students often come into colleges not fully realizing that these are going to be places where they're going to encounter disagreeable ideas, where ideas are hotly contested. And part of what they should expect when they arrive on a campus is they're going to encounter things that they find disturbing and unsettling and sometimes offensive. And that's part of what it means to go to college. Administrators ought to be trying to prepare those students when they come in to fully accept the kind of educational process that they're embarking on, so they're not taken by surprise and so they know how to behave correctly when they encounter particular episodes of speech they're uncomfortable with.
The book is Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor Keith Whittington. Keith, thank you so much for talking to me about this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's sort of a sad reality of our modern day, but one of the most effective ways to catalyze action on climate change might actually be to make it financially difficult for companies that don't take climate change seriously. And along those lines, we've learned that a British firm named Legal & General, which manages about $1.2 trillion in assets in mutual funds, is going to be pulling money from companies that ignore climate change or just generally have a bad record when it comes to the environment. And in addition to pulling funds, they'll be naming the companies specifically. And we recently heard from Helena Morrissey, who's the head of personal investing at the firm. And she said the financial sector needs to come together to actually drive change. I find this to be a very refreshing attitude, given that a lot of the people in these firms have the view of investment choice that is basically equivalent to show me the money. And we can play devil's advocate with this, right? We can say, well, it's possible that Legal & General is doing this simply for the PR benefit, right? The idea is get people to get media to write articles about how they're doing this. And that will get more people to invest money with them, and they'll make more money. My response to that would be, who cares, right? If they're actually going to pull funds from companies that damage the environment, I don't care if it's for PR, and it's a good move if people decide to move assets to companies that consider environmental impact in their investments. My only real concern is they might be left with very few companies to invest in some way, because obviously we can say, oh, oil companies are bad for the environment. But what about just really big retailers who have a huge carbon footprint like Amazon because they're shipping a single bar of soap fully across the country, right? Like, is that good for the environment or bad? And if you really think about what it means to be good or bad for the environment, I don't know how many companies you're ultimately going to have left, but I still think that it's a great decision. There's another counterpoint I've read to this, which is that, oh, it's all lovely and daisies and waterfalls and ginger snaps, but if you invest with your heart instead of with your mind, you will lose. I would make the case that you're not actually investing with your heart if you think it's important to invest sustainably, right? Because what will your investments be worth if we totally destroy our environment? That's going to be bad for the economy, that's going to be bad for humanity, and it's going to be bad for all companies eventually. So I think that if you're thinking beyond this quarter or this year, the real way to invest thoughtfully is to invest sustainably. I think investing with your heart would be like moving your investments to companies with the most sentimental TV commercials or something like that. That's not what's being done here. Actively moving your money to companies that are conscious of their environmental impact, I think, is actually investing with your mind. And I've been thinking about more and more of this personally. I mean, we've talked before, Pat, about my investment philosophy, which is buy long-term and hold the most diversified possible set of stocks. And usually, I mean, people know I use the company's Vanguard and Betterment. They have super, super low fees. I don't pick stocks. I don't time the market. I just, when I have a little extra money, I buy a total stock market index fund and I let it ride. I'm obviously invested in some oil companies as a result of that because I'm invested in the entire market. I think if, I hold tiny amounts of stocks, but if the real big players started doing this, it actually could influence company policy.
Thanks for the full disclosure. Now we know how this affects your commentary.
Yes, which I guess is not at all, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know what I own. I just know I own the entire stock market. The other thing, by the way, is that, well, I'm jumping the gun, Pat, but if you allow me just a moment, we might have a new partnership related to this generally to announce at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, Pat looks confused. I don't have anything to announce today, but I will at some point. And I think people will be very, very interested to hear more about that. But good move by Legal & General. I support this. Whenever we've talked about cases of discrimination by businesses, oftentimes the case of the gay wedding cake in, I think, Colorado comes up. You often see sexual orientation. By the way, what's a gay wedding cake? It's such a I just like call it's just such a stupid way to it exposes the absurdity of the case by calling it that. You often hear sexual orientation compared to political orientation, right? People will say to me when I say, I don't believe you're allowed to refuse service to a customer on the basis of their being gay if sexual orientation is a protected class. I'll get emails saying, David, if you can't refuse service to someone for being gay, then you can't refuse service to someone for being a Republican. And of course, I've always held that there's this thing called the law, because I'm a law and order progressive. This thing called the law in most states actually does allow for refusing to serve someone on the basis of their politics, because political orientation and affiliation are not protected classes. Depending on what state you're in, like in Washington, D.C., interestingly, political affiliation is a protected class. Washington, D.C. is also not a state. So in most states, Sexual orientation may be a protected class. Race, religion, and nationality are basically always protected classes. You can't refuse service to someone because they're black or Christian or Italian, but not listed there, for the most part, are political allegiances. There's nothing in the law that says a business can't say, we don't serve Republicans, or we don't serve Democrats, or we don't serve Green Party voters, as long as they're not also discriminating along the basis of a protected class. We've got a court decision from a Manhattan judge this week who says that a bar that threw out a Trump supporter, a 31-year-old named Greg Piatek, who was bounced from a bar last year for wearing a Make America Great Again hat, he sued, and ultimately the judge said, not a protected class. Political beliefs are simply not protected. And Greg, through his lawyer in the lawsuit, made the argument that being thrown out for wearing the hat offended his sense of being American. And they actually tried to argue, they didn't say that his support of Trump was a religious belief, but they said that it was part of his spirituality, which is kind of a cop-out. It's a way of trying to say it's a religious belief. In any case, the judge didn't fall for it. The judge said supporting Trump is not a religious belief, and came back and said there's no reason whatsoever for this lawsuit to go forward, and it's the obviously correct decision here.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it's usually the right-wingers who are against protected statuses,
Sure,
and also against the safe spaces, as we call them.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit backwards here, it seems.
When it's not good for them, all of a sudden the perspective is totally different. And I do want to say that there is a little bit of a gray area here, which is that even though political beliefs are not a religion, it's true that for a lot of Trumpists, their unconditional and dogmatic support for Trump is actually not that different than dogmatic religious beliefs. Legally, in the eyes of the law, that still doesn't make this a protected perspective when it comes to business service to just be a supporter of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it just doesn't feel right, though. Like, I understand your political beliefs in most areas, not a protected status.
Yeah.
But I don't think I would patronize a bar or restaurant that refused Republicans or Trumpists from going into it.
I think I would.
Feel right to me.
I have no problem with it. Like, what would feel? Do you believe that if you go there and you patronize the restaurant, that you're encouraging political divisiveness?
In a way, but it also just feels like a little bit reminiscent of the Jim Crow era in a way.
But
I know it's not targeting race. I get that. But what would they have, a sign on the door that says, like, no Trump supporters allowed? I couldn't get behind that.
You know what? They don't have to, because if someone goes in there and is a Trump supporter and they're not wearing a Make America Great Again hat, which you could argue is just a fashion statement, but you could argue is also, in Manhattan's West Village, after all, something deliberately meant to get a reaction. No one knows your politics. If you go into a bar and you're not wearing something that says I'm a Republican or whatever, and you order a drink, you're not being refused service on the basis of who you voted for, because no one knows who you voted for. What the bar basically did is evaluate a behavioral decision, which was to wear the hat. So I don't think we can say that it's the same as a sign that says no Republicans allowed.
I know. I mean, there are other things, though, that you can hide, like your religion. You can also hide. It's not apparent just from sitting at the bar that you could be a Jew or a Muslim or sexual orientation as well. I just don't feel like it feels American to me. So I would avoid a bar or restaurant that did that, personally. Patriotic
Pat makes a return. Yeah, that's a character that will every once in a while, not that it's a fake character, I just mean it's a part of your persona that will sometimes rear its head. All right.
You see, Milo Yiannopoulos was thrown out of a bar.
You mentioned that to me. Yeah, it wasn't a safe enough space for him, apparently.
I guess the Democratic Socialists of America didn't want him there, and they chanted him out.
Story for another day. We've got a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail that came in very, very early this morning.
Yes, there's a massive, undeniable amount of evidence that Germans went to Argentina. So the question is, if Hitler could send a bunch of his people to Argentina safely, why would he kill himself? Why wouldn't he just go to Argentina? That makes no freaking sense.
So this is someone following up on the Hitler fled to Argentina Patriot mail that we had yesterday. And I think that the caller believes the conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
That Hitler did go to Argentina and didn't kill himself
like
in the bunker. Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
I think that would be pretty hard to do, especially if you're the most wanted man in the entire world.
Yeah.
And the war's ending and you're wanted. You can't just flee.
And he also had to stage his own death with a lookalike, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of complexity to that one. Interestingly, though, at least 2 people in our audience believe it. We've got a great bonus show for you today. I'm out of time, but trust me, it's a really, really good one. I encourage you to get access to the bonus show through either being a patron or being a member, and we'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.